In our previous episode, we delved into the powerful dynasties that shaped the landscape of Southern Africa, the Monomotapa, the Togwa, and the Changomera dynasties. These kingdoms were all interconnected, beginning with the ancient kingdom of the Shiradengas, also known as Mapungubwe, which we've discussed in depth. The Shiradengas, flourishing around the 11th century, were among the earliest known societies in Southern Africa, showcasing advanced socio-political structures and long-distance trade networks. The region was rich in gold, which attracted traders from as far as Persia and China, contributing to its wealth and influence. Our story unfolded with the birth of Changa, the great king of the Changomera dynasty, born into the influential realms of Monomotapa and Togwa. Despite being born out of wedlock, and facing the hardships and stigma that came with it, Changa rose to build a formidable empire, transforming the southern regions of the continent. Changa's early life was marked by adversity. Being born out of wedlock in such a prestigious family meant he faced discrimination and had to constantly prove his worth. Despite these challenges, Changa's resilience and strategic acumen allowed him to overcome these obstacles. His military prowess and diplomatic skills helped him unite various clans under his leadership, laying the foundation for what would become the Changomera Empire. Pay close attention to Changa's tale, as you will encounter a similar story in future episodes. Another king from the same matrilineage, Togwa lineage, who, despite being born out of wedlock, grew to greatness. As dynasties rose and fell, we witnessed the emergence of another significant empire, the Lotswa, also known as Rovzi or Rovzi, the Great Kings. This empire was founded by the renowned Changomera Dombo. Though not directly descended from the Changomera dynasty, Dombo hailed from Togwa on Tumwa, the maternal homeland of the Changomera line. It is said that Changomera Dombo revived the ancient name Rovzi, a term denoting nobility under the Mutota or Zimbabwe state, derived from Hurutshe, meaning Great King. Dombo's rise to power was not just a testament to his leadership but also to his vision of unifying the fragmented territories. He strategically married into influential families and formed alliances that strengthened his position. Under his rule, the Rovzi kingdom became a beacon of stability and prosperity. Under Dombo's leadership, the Rovzi kingdom not only flourished but also played a pivotal role in defending the Monomotapa Kingdom against Portuguese incursions. Changomera Dombo and his Rovzi army triumphed over the Portuguese, pushing them back to the coast, ensuring the prosperity of his kingdom. The battles against the Portuguese were significant. The Portuguese, seeking control over the region's lucrative gold trade, posed a considerable threat. However, Dombo's strategic military tactics, combined with his understanding of the terrain and local support, led to decisive victories. These victories not only safeguarded his kingdom but also ensured the preservation of their cultural heritage. As we continue our journey through history, we will highlight these patriarchs, many of whom were known by different names across various nations. These kings had numerous wives, often from other lands, and their children spread across southern Africa, founding their own tribes and legacies. The intermarriages and the spread of these royal lineages created a complex web of relationships and influences across the region. This not only facilitated cultural exchange but also laid the groundwork for future alliances and conflicts. The descendants of these kings played crucial roles in shaping the socio-political landscape of Southern Africa.
Chapter 11. The last of the Black empires. On a balmy spring afternoon in 1964, I came out of a large cave where archaeologists had been working and climbed up the highest of 6 hills in the area. In the valley, and as far as the eyes could see, there was so much of the same breathtaking natural beauty that had been seen everywhere in the country that one might wonder whether the Garden of Eden surpassed it. I was standing in the heart of Monomotapa, now white-ruled Rhodesia, the last of the Black empires in Africa. Abyssinia, a modern Ethiopia, has been under Semitic or Solomonic rule for centuries. The ruling house traces its line to King Solomon. Up to this point, we have been dealing very largely with states created or expanded by migrating groups before the coming of Asians and Europeans into their territories. We have therefore been looking at purely African created institutions. But the picture has been very much skewed by the fact that very little attention has been given to the advanced states of early civilization in other parts of the continent prior to the incursions of this or that group of immigrants after the 1200s AD. This kind of treatment has misled many in the belief that a highly advanced civilization existed only in the Nile regions of ancient Ethiopia, Egypt, and the Sudan, and was spread southward therefrom by the various ways of immigrants. The simple truth is that there were northward migrations as well as southward from all earliest times, that these early Black brothers from the south probably brought more to their Black brothers in Egypt than they borrowed from them is becoming clearer as our research develops. The stepped up waves of crisis migrations after the destruction of the Ethiopian empire should not obscure the certain facts. The invading immigrants then often found the already existing states as well organized and with institutions as highly advanced as their own had been before the 13th century. But almost without exception, they all had one thing in common. The one thing that made each one so easy to conquer, first by Black invaders and later by white invaders. They were all small, and smaller and weaker the state, the more fiercely independent it was. The African continent presented a vast panorama of many states, that once a vast panorama of disunity and weakness. The reorganizing invaders tended to expand territorially over many of these adjacent states, thus forcing a kind of artificial unity. Unlike the Cuba of Siam and the Angola of Nzinga, few undertook the great task of developing a sense of national community among the many diverse groups that made up the state. The Vakaranga immigrants who developed the empire of Monomotapa followed the general practice of establishing effective political rule while promoting economic development. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Happy Monday, welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, continuing my reading of Chancellor Williams' great book, The Destruction of Black Civilization. We're picking up here on chapter 11, The Last of the Black Empires on page 290. And this video goes from page 290 to 307. That's the total reading for this video. And we're dealing with the kingdom of Monomotapa. Now, what's interesting is Chancellor Williams is talking about the small, independent, weak states. And further into this reading, we're going to learn about the coming together of the empire of Monomotapa. But we're also going to see if that coming together of that empire was actually something good for them or something bad for them, knowing that, you know, the small states were some of the things that kind of gave those African empires their, I guess you could say, their power. So the small states, basically what I'm getting at is, and you'll see as we go through the reading, is the small states themselves, they had strengths and weaknesses. The empires themselves had strengths and weaknesses, and built into it because of the African code of conduct and the African way of life, in conjunction with the Europeans or the expanding, the the expanding fellow African states, or the invasions of the Asians, Arabs, or Europeans. Those small states were vulnerable, but those empires were vulnerable because of the constitution or the code that the Africans, that they created, that they lived by. And so those constitutions or those codes were created for these small states. But when these empires came together, these empires had to come together to try to better protect themselves. But these small states, but the codes, rather, the code that upheld the small states was soon to be something that was destructive to the empire. And, you know, we're reading more about the incoming of the Arabs, the incoming of the Portuguese. And then we're going to read about the British and the Dutch as well. And then we're going to get into the rise of the Zulu under the leadership of Shaka himself. And so all of this is coming together as we expand down to South Africa, to the southern regions of Africa, and getting into how Monomotapa rose and also how Monomotapa fell. Remember to like this video, comment, subscribe, and share. Make sure as many people get this information as possible. Happy Black History Month. If I haven't said it yet, I don't think I've said it yet, but happy Black History Month. Let's make sure that we use this month to refuel ourselves and go through the rest of the year being our greatest Black selves. So let's jump back into the reading. We are on page 291 at the second paragraph to the last. As forecast above, however, we shall look briefly at the people and their civilization some centuries before the Vakaranga advent in the early 1400s. The land and the people to be covered by the empire extended to the north above the Zambezi River, included Rhodesia, westward to the Kalahari, eastward over Mozambique to the Indian Ocean, and southward to the Transvaal and South Africa below the Limpopo River. Since the archaeological evidence gathered all over this vast territory makes it clear that iron technology and allied crafts were well advanced here long before the Christian era, the spread of the economic revolution over Africa by the Iron Age may have come from this southern center as well as from Meroe in the northeast. From the period roughly indicated as early as 300 BC, the states which were to form the empire of Monomotapa were engaged in a wide range of diversified economic activities that led not only to interstate trade, but foreign commerce over the Indian Ocean as well. The economic development was inextricably an index of the development to their civilization. The drive for the attainment of excellence in everything produced was reflected in their artistic endeavors, even on common utilities where art could hardly be expected. The huge jars for storing grain were glazed and as beautifully channeled as the cups used by the priests and kings. Here, as elsewhere in early Africa, there seems to have been an insatiable drive for beauty and perfection. There was an underlying philosophy. Each craftsman felt that his finished work was done at once a reflection and actual measure of what he himself was, his character. The industrial activities, particularly mining, overshadowed agriculture and even threatened the existence of the very basic economy. Over 4,000 ancient mining sites have been discovered, and no one claims that all these are all iron or gold, and to a lesser extent copper and tin were the leading industrial activities, although ivory and ivory carvings always played a considerable role in the total economy. These widespread industrial activities, along with the ever-increasing number of cattle brought in by migrating pastoral groups, drove the farmers to the hills, to a new type of terrace farming on every available hillside, and the building of mounds for the same purpose where there were no hills. As difficult as all this was, the genius of the African man was further tested in overcoming the more formidable problem of water and an irrigation system for hillsides and mounds. Widespread mining meant widespread deforestation because of the demand for timber or charcoal production, another industry by itself. Soil erosion kept pace unchecked. The steadily disappearance of grasslands was assured by cattle and other roaming animals that fed on the grass, the goats being the more ravishing. The agricultural life of the country was sustained by intensive terrace farming in the northeast region, of which Inyanga was the center. In 1200 AD, production and international trade had already reached a high level of affluence that was to attract Arabs and Europeans to the land. Gold was the leading export commodity, although there was also a great demand in India for the superior type of ironware processed in Monomotapa. The African smelting process and type of iron ore peculiar to the region enabled them to produce the best swords, spears, and other weapons that could be found anywhere. The iron industries created an economic revolution, not only in warfare, but also in the production of farming tools, household and kitchenware, and better mining tools. The crafts of blacksmiths, goldsmiths, coppersmiths, and tinsmiths were the most important, which being a well-organized secret society. Quite early and without any Bronze Age period, they experimented with alloys to tin and copper and began to produce of bronze and bronze implements on a limited scale. The widespread pottery finds of so many different types indicate the vastness of their ceramic industries. The decorative designs of all pottery, as well as on other artifices, seem to tell us that all of these early craftsmen were artists also. There were many other highly skilled and professional classes, is evident from the total cultural record these early blacks left behind in Southern Africa. The several thousand mining sites of so many different kinds, iron, gold, copper, tin, suggest expert prospectors, just as the ruins of nearby temples and other beautifully designed stone structures tell us that there were great black architects and stonemasons here, just as they had been in Black Egypt when the first pyramids were built. But the ancient ruins of so many cities, towns, and villages are the stony pages of the unwritten history we seek. And just as written records of Black history are destroyed, here too in Monomotapa, the first Arabs and Europeans to find these long since desired sites undertook wrecking and destroying operations on a scale beyond belief. These were your modern men, your civilizers of other men, hidden and lost in the tangled vines and trees of forest. Many stone temples were still defying the centuries of passing time and standing in all the dignity of their colonnaded beauty until the 20th century, when they were wrecked by the same people who had wrecked the race of the builders. The fact that almost all of these ruins were located in or near gold mining areas enabled some writers to explain that the wanton destruction was carried on in a feverish search for gold. Yeah, okay. But anyone viewing the nature and scale of the demolition of the massive stone structures would find it difficult to see how the search for gold involved the destruction of buildings. Their efforts were in vain, however. So much could be reassembled, reconstructed. So much could not be destroyed at all. There was therefore a record left written in stone, a record that tells the story of blacks who were building a highly developed civilization in Southern Africa during the same ancient period that their brothers were amazing the world by their advances in northern Ethiopia and its southern region, the Sudan. So the empire of Monomotapa was a vast empire. It had these large stone structures that when the Arabs and the Europeans came in, you know, they're trying to erase the history. Well, they did their best to erase the history of the Africans who built these civilizations and these empires that they continuously destroyed. So remember, if they can destroy what the Africans built, they can tell the story the way they want to tell the story, and it makes it look like they were the original ones there. And if any glory is to be handed out, it would go to them. But what we're going to learn more is how Monomotapa is such an African empire and had so much African influence by the African people who built the empire and sustained the empire. And we're going to learn about two of the greatest rulers of the empire of Monomotapa and how great leadership has to be followed up by great leadership, which is supported by great followership. And when great leadership is not in existence, chaos ensues. And when chaos ensues, that means that you're not following the code. And when you're not following the code, we know what that means: ultimate destruction. So let's get into it, right? The empire builders. We have been establishing the high civilization of Monomotapa, for which the invading Vakaranga have been credited, antedated with their coming by at least 1,500 years. During this long period before the Rovzi chiefs led their people into the region in 1400, around 1400 rather, there were many changes and improvements in the methods and styles of the various crafts. The changes were shown by determining the period of such artifacts as pottery and the architectural designs of buildings. The Vakaranga simply continued to build upon the further developed pre-existing states. The greatest achievements was in welding several strong states, some lesser ones, into one great empire. Their second greatest achievements was the reclaiming of the seacoast lands that had been leased by the states to Asians as trading posts, but over which the Asians had gradually assumed absolute sovereignty. It is the same old story of the same techniques of penetration and domination that had to be repeated over and over in these pages as we move from century to century and country to country. Ethiopia, Makuria, Alwa, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, the Maasai states, Congo, Angola, Cuba, all were destroyed as a direct result of the first trading posts, footholds established in their lands. Basically, when you're allowing people to trade, when you're allowing these foreigners to trade in your lands, and these foreigners have a history of conquering and destruction, allowing them in your land is the beginning, the end of your lands. And so far, it was for the other states on the continent, large or small. None withstood the siren sons of the fabulous riches to be gained from trade. As the history of this region of Africa was generally written on the gatherers that had advanced cultures on the seacoast and key islands were of Asian origin, the black barbarians being confined to the interior. The fact is that while readily granting concessions to trade and settlement to the Asians on lands along the Indian Ocean coastlines, Africans did not withdraw, but remained as active sea captains, sailors, traders, boat and ship builders, and in short, all in the ongoing occupations along the seacoast. The builders of stone cities in the interior also built where Arabs, Indians, and later Portuguese settled at Sofala, Chindi, Quilmaine, and further north at Kilwa. When the cattle breeding Vakaranga came into the country under the leadership of the Rovzi ruling clan, they found the indigenous people more highly advanced than themselves. The fact that so many of these states came into prominence between the 13th and 16th centuries were further reorganized and expanded by newcomers has tended to obscure the pre-existing civilizations upon which the immigrants built. There were several kinds of invaders. Some were from a homeland only recently broken up. These could make immediate contributions to their own society of whatever was new in advance, whatever skills or technologies that had not been lost or forgotten. Other migrating groups had been on the move from one settlement to another for so many generations that they had lost some of the most essential elements in the heritage of their distant forebears. During these constant movements from place to place, movements which were the most potent factors of disintegrating civilizations itself. And still other invaders were ruthless barbarians, pure and simple. Even these, after being absorbed by the advanced population, were often given the credit for the new advances made by the state. Some of these societies in this great region were on different levels of development. Among these were the Soto, the Swana, the Mate, I'm gonna mess this name up, the Mate de Yada, or the so-called Bushmen, the Vatanga, the etc., right? The Arabs, of course, had been slowly penetrating the interior from their seacoast footholds for over 200 years before the Vakaranga arrived. By 1400, they had their trading posts scattered throughout the independent states, which were to form the empire. According to D.P. Abraham, by 1500, about 10,000 Arabs were stationed at different points in the interior. They had been penetrating inland all the way from beyond Kilwa to stations southward below Sofala. The major built-in threat was complete. The first great Vakaranga king surveyed the scene. So even before the empire could even be fully built, the Arabs had their footholds in place. The Arabs were in place, 10,000 strong. They already have sovereignty along the seacoast. Then they're moving further and further into the interior to make sure that they can have power, have influence, have position to be able to take over if need be. If these Negroes start to build something, they can take over. So we're talking about Monomotapa. Its enemies are the Arabs, the Portuguese, the British, the Dutch, and even other African nations or African states. And remember, these outsiders, these invaders are also taking advantage of the disunity that existed in Africa before they got there. They're exploiting it. But we're going to learn about the Great Mutota. And the Great Mutota is more about unity than about the regular individualism, right? So the Great Mutota is a threat to the Arabs. The Great Mutota is a threat to the Portuguese at the time because the Dutch and the British hadn't come in yet. Unity is the key. Black unity is the key. But what type of black unity? According to the code that you live by, because everybody don't live by the same code. Because remember, the continent was vast. But now if we're looking at it from today's terms, what code do we live by here in Black America? What code do you live by in the UK, black people in the UK? What code do you live by? Black people in Jamaica, what code do you live by? Black people in Cuba, black people in Haiti, black people in the Dominican Republic, black people all throughout South America, black people all throughout the diaspora. There are different codes of conduct, but we still need a unified African code of conduct. But the fact that even in these separate places where African people are spread out, there is no unified code of conduct for these people in their separate places. But unity is the key. Unity is what the white men fear. Now, the white men don't fear us now because we're not unified. But if we become unified, oh man, we become a threat. The year was 1440. The king was Mutota. In just about any other land, he would be known to history as Mutota the Great. He and his council was apparently quick to see that even the most advanced states, each standing independently and alone, were doomed unless unified into a single nation with a strong central government. This should be achieved by voluntary association if possible. The divisive influence of the Arabs operating in the capitals of the respective states had to be obvious, as they appeared not to feel it necessary to be either as secretive or as subtle as their Portuguese enemies. Both the Arabs and the Europeans had one thing in common. However, both had deeply rooted conviction that they knew the blacks and their power over them, and the continued ability to garner their endless wealth rested squarely on keeping them divided and continuously at each other's throat. No one except the blacks themselves needed any argument to show that black unity meant black power, and black power meant an end to white domination, Eastern and Western. They knew where almost all the gold, copper, iron, and tin had been going from over 4,000 miles. They knew how all the stratagems used by the blacks to bar the Arabs from the interior had failed and would continue to fail as long as the Arabs controlled all overseas trade by controlling the entire seaboard, and having done so unchallenged for so long that they claimed sovereignty over the whole coastal area. Therefore, Mutota in 1440 began the campaign to carry out his own grand design, a great plan that aimed at nothing less than uniting blacks in a vast empire that cut across South Africa below the Limpopo River, covered Rhodesia with an infinite boundary beyond the Zambezi River and Zambia, and over Mozambique to the Indian Ocean, sweeping southward again to repossess the entire coastline, fronting the new empire. Now, is all of this the same version as given by Abraham and other Western historians? Would an Arab historian, no matter what the facts might be, present it this way? Of course not. The Western historian, employing their usual club to crush rebellion from the master's viewpoint, would proclaim sheer romanticism. For see here now, listen, does not Professor Abraham make it quite clear that the very outset that no black man, king, or commoner could have conceived such a vast undertaking? What black man, unaided by whites, could have Mutota's great and awe-inspiring vision? Abraham and his school might well think their God that there were many white Arabs around whom such credit could be given. After a review of so many centuries of ideological stance of writers where blacks are concerned, anger and outrage could be replaced with amusement. For it has become amusing to this writer, at any rate, to witness the sweating dilemma of these investigators when confronted with any kind of all-black achievements, even in relatively unimportant and routine matters, which any human beings, any people of any race could be thought capable of achieving. But where blacks are involved and anything considered outstanding, the whites somehow feel threatened. What is threatening, of course, is the deeply rooted presupposition of the innate inferiority of blacks. If somewhere in the long history, a single record of outstanding achievement by blacks was found by whites and declared at once to be such, rather and evidently non-Negroid, if this was ever done, the black world has been unable to discover it. And if there is an error here or a misconception, a correction is welcome. But returning to the traditional white line, in this case of the Vacaranga king, Abraham and others say that the Arabs persuaded him to unify and expand the country north and south to the Indian Ocean. The Arabs who had nothing to gain from a strong and unified black empire and might lose what they had. Professor Abraham says that the Arabs conceived and implemented the mind of the Rovzi king as a desire of empire. The empire was to serve as an effective umbrella, protecting their operations in the country from the Portuguese. Scholarly reasoning, logical, right? Nah, not really, right? Of course, except that there were no Portuguese threat in the area in 1440. They did not arrive until 65 years later. So Professor Abraham uses a lie. Professor Abraham. And Professor Abraham is not just a real person, but also a metaphor for the white people, right? Meanwhile, Mutota moved forward. His first move was to recruit and build up strong, well-trained armies, each under an able general. He displayed the mark of a great executive by his keen insight in the evaluation and selection of men for posts of high responsibility, and in so doing, securing the active support of the great council of the realm. It is significant, too, that his leadership strategy included recruiting soldiers from the surrounding states, which were not yet parts of the projected empire. Another important move was to secure unity through the voluntary association of as many states as possible before any conquest by force were attempted. The usual African pattern of empire building was followed. All states joining the imperial union were not only assured of autonomy, but special rights also, such as membership in the Great Council of the Empire, a privilege denied territories that had to be conquered. With these policies reaffirmed and settled, Mutota's formidable armies began their sweep in the different planned directions and fields of operation. The main drive was northward under the command of the king himself. Within 10 years, all territory between the Limpopo in South Africa and the Zambezi had been brought under imperial rule. The great undertaking was far from completion when Mutota died in 1450. The objectives had been worked out in detailed specifications of a blueprint for expansion, unification, and development of a great empire composed of great states. So Mutota started his campaign, started defeating these Arab strongholds, but then he passed away. So what happens now? See, a great king has to be followed up by another great king, and Mutota was followed up by his son. Unlike most of the societies we have been studying, the Vacaranga clans had become patrilineal. Therefore, Mutota's son, rather than his nephew, was the successor to the throne. This was a happy circumstance, since the son, Matope, turned out to be as great a statesman, king, and general as his late father. He had the greater task because some of the most powerful states in the blueprint had yet to be won, and breaking Arab control of the seacoast, the greatest undertaking, had not yet been achieved. Matope assumed the leadership aggressively, having the good fortune of securing the same loyalty the ablest generals had given to his father, supported by financially devoted soldiers. fanatically devoted soldiers. This was no accident, for Matope himself had been a popular young commander during his father's reign. Above all, Changa and Togwa, two of Matope's greatest generals, were his friends. The armies were reorganized, strengthened by relentless training, and expanded. The display of both strength and unity among the blacks puzzled the Arabs. This was something new, amazing. They had a long history of dealing with blacks, and nothing was better known than the disunity, mutual suspicions, and hostility of one group toward another. So how to explain this spectacle of over 30 different tribal groups forming solid phalanxes of unity under black leaders? Moreover, the Arabs, who had always maintained their own troops under Arab officers, were barred from joining the imperial forces by both Mutota and Matope. Good. All this was seen as a very real threat to the powerful commercial position the Arabs had in the hetero-independent states, as well as the equally powerful political influence they enjoyed at the capitals of these states, not to mention their independent status to the coast. Matope's campaign for the unification of many states into one empire was not easy, for although the Arabs pledged and proclaimed their unifying loyalty to the new emperor, as the mission of the empire building advanced, they secretly gave active support to armies of resisting states. Some of the key states that formed the empire, and I'm gonna mess a lot of these names up, were Mbiri, Ganiswa in the southern region, Chidima, Utonga, Barwe, Manyinka, Mandonda, Shiringoma formed the eastern and southeastern region. It took 30 years of unremitting efforts to complete the empire of Monomotapa, with its long eastern border bathed at last by the Indian Ocean. Every detail of its father's specifications have been carried out in full. A weary emperor, worn out by the task, retired for the final sleep. The year was 1480. So, Matope carried out his father's plans, but subsequently passed. And so now, who is in control of Monomotapa? Who will move the empire forward? Who will keep the unity? Who will keep the code? Who will be the strong emperor that won't be the sellout for the Portuguese or even the Arabs or even the coming British or the Dutch? Who will assume that role? Because we know that if there's not a strong emperor, the destruction of that empire is imminent, right? So let's read on. Let's see. The Emperor Matope also left the country with a great organized religion, with a powerful and formally organized priesthood, something unusual in Africa outside of ancient Egypt and Ethiopia. The traditional African religion is essentially the same everywhere on the continent, but it is generally unorganized and therefore has seldom had an organized priesthood with a single recognized creed or body of prescribed beliefs. Yet just about every African society known believed in one almighty God, no matter by what name he was called or how many lesser gods there might be. In Monomotapa, he was called Mwari, the Vakaranga version and contribution toward national unity, right? There were unifying factors which Matope left behind in his great empire. One was that same organized religion led by a highly advanced and literate priesthood. Religious temples at the Great Zimbabwe was certainly the national center of religion. The other important factor that should have made unity imperative was the greater prosperity that would flow from economic independence and close commercial relations between the constituent states and provinces. The great system of roads and highways, instead of being recaptured by the bush and forest after serving their initial military purpose, could have been converted into permanent national highways, crisscrossing the empire and thus serving the insatiable communication links for administration, trade, travels by people, and ensure unification. The other factors that should have been a solid foundation for Black unity were the similarity and other social institutions and the absolute sameness of their constitutional system. Yet, with Matope's death, the empire began to break up. Why? Notwithstanding all the forces mentioned above that should have made for unity and stability, the actual fact is that the traditional African political system was fundamentally and structurally anti-empire. Remember, I teased this in the beginning. I'm gonna read it again. The traditional African political system was fundamentally and structurally anti-empire. The very circumstance of the endless process of segmentation, of forever splintering off to form little independent mini-states, developed a built-in disunity, reinforced by the attending growth of different languages. But self-government in each little state and in every village of the smallest state of chiefdom was a way of life, not a theory. Chiefs and elders, as we have seen, were leaders and advisors and representatives of the people and not their rulers. The same operating principle prevailed when a group of states united to form a kingdom and kingdoms united to form an empire, but with a disturbing difference. Centralization tended to erode local autonomy, tended to transfer chiefs from the control of their people to the control of the central government. In the case of the conquered territories, this change was abrupt and painful, and it was one of the principal reasons for later rebellions and the breakup of kingdoms and empires. Therefore, to say that Arabs and Europeans, let us say it again, were solely or even mainly responsible for the destruction of all great African states will be glossing over or attempting to ignore the principal internal factor: disunity. Disunity was built into the African way of life as far as being anti-empire because of the way the states were structured, the way the independent states were structured. What the whites did, Asians and Europeans, was to appraise this continent-wide disunity and cash in on it to the fullest extent possible. They did not have to divide and conquer even, for the blacks were already divided, just as though they were waiting for the foreign conquerors to come. The foreigners' roles was to intensify the disunity and to promote suspicions and hatred that developed from it, and to check any tendency of movement toward unity among the blacks. All the Arabs had to do in Monomotapa was to move swiftly during the period of mourning, confusion, and uncertainty following Matope's death. Advisors would surely be needed at the various provincial capitals more than ever. Surely from these key bases, they effectively furthered the destruction of an empire, the very existence of which a threat to their own power position within it. It was more than a threat, for had not Matope's sweep to the Indian Ocean reduced their control there, leaving them with only three trading stations. The Africans, already having the every province for itself psychology, were simply urged to do more speedily, or they were doing more slowly in their own way. Of Changa and Togwa, it must be said to their honor that both remained loyal to Mutota and Matope throughout their lifetime, devoted servants, able generals, and finally governors of two of the most important provinces, a period of devoted service extending over 40 years. Now, however, there appeared to be no reason or even a possibility of transferring the same loyalty and love to Nahuma, a weak son and successor to the great king. The Arabs hastened to exploit this in Guiniswa. I might be messing this name up, but Guiniswa, where Changa was king with aspirations to become emperor. Togwa, king of Mbire, supported his longtime friend and colleague in the imperial venture. Both occupied the most favorable position of rallying support, for they held the southern region, which was the first center of Karanga power, the center for which the expansion spread and the localization of the first Zimbabwe capital. Right? So now this unity is brewing. So watch the Arabs take advantage of the disunity, right? The Arab strategy must not be overlooked. Beyond the consideration of the greater concessions from the winning side, they did not care which side won. They worked for and supported all sides, each against the other. None wanted a strong empire, but they wanted Changa to launch a war against the existing empire under the pretext of building a greater one than was possible under the emperor Nahuma. The Arabs in the north, of course, could use Nahuma to crush the pretensions of the upstart Changa in the south. The Arabs in both regions did more than just advise. They backed their respective rulers with money and materials and men, black men, that is. The Arabs owned private armies of black troops. Thus, the Arabs and later the Europeans were always able to send into battle still more blacks against blacks. So now Changa, grown old and uncertain, was given an entirely new vision of greatness. He could not only capture the empire, but become as great an emperor as he was a general. But in doing so, he would create a great brotherhood of Arabs and Africans, a brotherhood in which Arab could be his faithful servants as citizens. To crown it all, and in testimony thereof, he was given the unprecedented honor of the Arab title of Emir, so that in the case of the immortal Caesar, his very name, and I'm gonna mess this name up, but Changamir, the Changamir would mean emperor forever. This flattery was too much for the old man to withstand. The new Changamir concluded his war against the central government with victory and the death of Nahuma in the battle of 1490. It was again the same old story of the wars that followed, the internal chaos during the rise and fall of one section of the empire after another. The murder of Changamir, or in short, the fragmentation of the empire until what remained was the much reduced northern region of about 600 miles along the Indian Ocean to an inland depth of between 200 and 300 miles. In this much reduced and weakened state, Monomotapa had to meet a still more ruthless enemy when the Portuguese arrived in 1505. They were aggressive. Their original aim was to replace the Arabs first, to break and take over their commercial and political power, and all of the now disunited kingdoms was ruthlessly pursued. This, it will be recalled, was implementing the original grand design, that designed in Congo and Angola. Within 50 years, they had penetrated all of these kingdoms, securing concessions of land, establishing trading posts and missions throughout the interior, as well as along the Zambezi and Indian Ocean coast and inlands. The Arabs did not take all this without a fierce struggle, largely centered around attempting to incite the blacks against the Portuguese, and thus creating further chaotic situations out of which they hoped somehow emerged on top. The murder of a Portuguese priest at the court of Monomotapan Empire in 1561 was just what the Portuguese needed as a reason for open intervention with eventual Portuguese sovereignty over the entire region. It was an old trick, well known and practiced by the secret agents of powers, to sacrifice one's own fellow citizen in a foreign land, if by so doing the larger ends of the state might be served. The Portuguese version of the priest's death was engineered by Mohammedans of Mozambique, who have or may not have been true. The Portuguese themselves may have done it. This death then meant that the honor of Portugal had been challenged. Instead of attacking the Arabs charged with the crime, however, they directed their pretended outrage at the tottering Black Empire with military intervention. In 1575, an ultimatum disguised as a treaty required the emperor to expel all Arabs from the country, grant more land concessions from Portuguese gold mining operations, more trading posts and missions, and finally in 1629, the great objective was reached when the emperor, Maura, acknowledged the king of Portugal as his overlord and became a vassal. Oh Lord, he tripping. Portuguese Caucasianization of the blacks had begun early by having all chiefs, kings, and emperors replace their African names with Portuguese names. There was therefore a long line of emperors, Sebastianos, Felipes, Domingos, and Alfonsos here, as in Congo and in Angola. Change the name, change the mind, right? The Portuguese land grabs all over the region meant that they were not content with political overlordship and commercial supremacy, but were physically taking more of absolute ownership of the lands of the people in all areas. When the Emperor Domingos summoned up enough courage to resist the onslaught of 1663, he was murdered. This was the year Queen Nzinga died, and Portugal now felt unchallenged. Meanwhile, the Portuguese were riding so high and mighty that they had set up their own capitals in the interior of Massapa and in Mankinia, centers of general administration and commerce. The great Zimbabwe capital city of the empire had a mere shadow of Portuguese power, useful only in carrying out their orders, and as was the case with the other towns and cities, began to disintegrate toward a state of ruins as the gold wealth of the nations was taken over and the population of the country by the slave trade spread. The highly organized African religion under a priesthood that had been so powerful that had blockaded The spirit of Islam for over 200 years was now swept aside by the aggressively pushed Christian missions in almost every village. My God is more powerful than your God, so worship my God. And if you don't worship my God, you shall be destroyed by my God. So worship my God and follow my God so we can take over your lands. In 1693, the seemingly all-powerful Portuguese were amazed by the rapid development of an unexpected phenomenon, the revival of Black unity in the southern provinces, which were the original center of the empire, now still under leadership of the continuing line of the Chamarang. I'm messing this name up. The Chanamarang's. I'm just saying that Chanamarang's. I'm just saying it like that. Other formerly separatist kingdoms united under Chanamarang's leadership and opened a full-scale war against the Portuguese, aiming at driving them out of the land. The successful military tactics of Matope and his generals were remembered and followed. Careful unrest training and organization, the secret movement of troops in small groups in different directions, all assembling en masse at a stated time and place near the enemy strongholds. Then the swift moving, generally surprise attacks by different armies on different Portuguese centers at the same time. These operations took 2 years of desperate fighting because, of course, the Portuguese forces were better armed. According to the oral records of the Blacks, the real reason for the series of victories over the Portuguese was their Black troops only put up token resistance, often not even that, whole companies deserting to join their Black brothers. With their Black shield thus removed, the Portuguese themselves not exposed to danger. The number killed was frightening. They fled the country to zones of comparative safety. The Chamarang armies reconquered most of Monomotapa, and a vigorous anti-Portuguese policy was adopted. This not only aimed at their total exclusion from the interior, but also at ending their influence in what remained of the old empire, which did not come directly under the Chamarang rule. Even trade relations with the whites and other contacts had to be carried on through blacks and mulattoes. The greatly reduced Monomotapa continued to be further destroyed by the endless eternal strife among the Blacks, frustrated by the states of decline and helplessness. Yet, unwilling to join forces with the stronger southern kingdoms, which were united under the Chamarangs. Decade after decade, the same story of chaos, social disorganization, and decline repeated itself. This time, however, neither Portuguese nor Arabs were able to reestablish their former power position throughout the region. For while all this was going on during the 17th, 18th, and on to the 19th centuries, 3 other threatening storm centers had been rising in South Africa. 2 of these, the British and the Dutch, had moved inland from the Cape, establishing republics and thereby completing the encirclement of the Blacks of Africa. A most significant development to which I have referred several times, the third threat insofar as Monomotapa was concerned, was the rapid rise and expansion of the Zulu Empire under Shaka, an empire which developed from a small village state. We have seen that the great migrations over the continent developed from many different causes, took many different forms, and went in all directions, and have been sent that whole Black communities fled before incoming Black conquerors, just as they did when whites invaded their land. The great Zulu Emperor King became more ruthless in his onslaughts to unify the Blacks in an empire that would be greater and stronger than the undisciplined and therefore falling Monomotapa, an empire unlike Monomotapa that would not only serve as one vast impregnable fortress against the shrewdly scheming whites swarming up from the Cape, but a fortress from which they could be attacked and destroyed. Shaka and his people, like other countries we have studied, have never seen a white face before the invasions, but he had learned about them more and more as they approached the borders of his country. To resist, he had to unify the Blacks first. Kings and chiefs who could not see the danger in so many little independent states had better prepare to submit to the imperial rule of the Zulu, flee, or prepare to meet their maker. The countless thousands fled in mass before Shaka's mighty armies. Many tribal states moved as a swelling tide under powerful kings and chiefs, spread death and destruction over the lands through which they marched, a wild and merciless rampage that expressed their anger over Shaka on all the people in their path. So Monomotapa is falling. The Zulu kingdom is rising. The Arabs, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British, all the foreign invaders looking to take over Africa, to take a hold and claim for themselves land in Africa that they can rule and benefit off of and help enrich their empires. But the indigenous African people are still fighting against the invaders, still fighting for their freedom, still fighting for their sovereignty, which they should be. But all that fighting, all these centuries and centuries and centuries of fighting, the African empires are becoming weaker and weaker. Some are strong, some are very formidable. But all of the fighting, the people have been fighting for centuries, thousands of years, fighting the invaders, fighting for their freedom. At some point, all that fighting is going to come to a head. So we're going to see what happens with that in chapter 12. Remember, from page 290 to page 307 is this chapter, chapter 11. So make sure you check it out, read it, learn about Monomotapa as we go into learning about Shaka Zulu and the Zulu Empire, the rise and fall of these African empires, and why these African empires keep falling the way they keep falling. So let's keep reading, man. Remember, like this video, comment, subscribe, share. Let's keep learning. Let's keep employing what we learn. Let's keep using what we learn. Let's not just learn it just to learn it just to say we learn it, or just to say we know it for the intellectual masturbation. Let's learn it to use it to improve upon ourselves and become a better Black version of ourselves today as we were yesterday. I love you all, and make sure you catch the next video coming up.